example again. We have a distributed hash table here with a couple of nodes that store some content, and we have an attacker that says, well, I know the person whose content is stored at 212, I want to attack that content. So what the attacker does is it joins the network arbitrary, so it hashes its IP address, and if he's lucky, or sooner or later, he will get a message of somebody who wants to call that person and says, well, I need the content for 212. So the attacker then can pass on the message, and on the way back, it can exchange, you see this down here, the IP address, it gives back to the originator of the request. Now if the attacker is clever, he probably will give it back an IP address under his control, so he can also launch an attack on the RTP stream as well. Okay, this is just a rough overview how this works. Of course, there's much more detail involved. So what can we do for authentication in peer-to-peer zip? Basically, there's three things we can do. We can, of course, add a central authority, but I guess we don't want to do that because we want to keep up with the spirit of peer-to-peer computing. We don't want a central authority there for the reasons I've put up there. Yeah, a lot of researchers have introduced reputation management systems in the absence of a central authority, for example, for file sharing. So we could use this for zip as well. But then we have new questions because most reputation systems out there are basically the eBay type reputation management where you get a 1-0 decision for a successful transaction, or with file sharing a successful file retrieval. But with the zip this is different. What do you gain reputation for? And so the issues, and this really hasn't been developed. What you also could use is a self-certifying zip URI. I've proposed to do this. There's a reference in the paper if you're interested. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go in this, but with a self-certifying approach, you really have a zip URI that is cryptographic, and you can sign messages, and everybody can verify these. So to summarize, because we don't have a central authority, there is authentication is really a tough problem in a peer-to-peer network. I guess this is obvious. So I'm almost done. Here's my conclusion, and it's really short. So I guess we have time for questions, which is good. I've tried to show you the difference between the public switch telephone network and zip-based voice over IP, and I hope I've shown you through this talk that these are really significant differences that affect security, and basically all the security problems we have today follow from these differences. There are many efforts underway to secure zip-based voice over IP. I've given you insight into some domains and mentioned some others. And zip security is an interesting, still evolving field, and I should have underlined here still evolving. There's still much work going on, standards are being developed, standards that have been developed are changed. So this is an active field where lots of work is going on, and still many things are not clear how they will end up eventually. And finally, if we end up with a peer-to-peer solution, we will have many new and different security challenges, so there's lots of work to do. And I hope that I gave you an insight on how all these security problems, how important they really are, and you get an idea what the challenges are. So thanks for your attention, and if you have any questions, you can also send me an email, or I guess now we have 10 minutes. Thank you. Any questions? Oh.
You told several times about the need for a global PKI infrastructure. But what about storing the keys or certificates for the domains in DNS?
Well, I mean, DNS is not secure.
Yeah.
Right?
DNS has been deployed by 2 countries already.
Well, I mean, but DNSSEC basically is a public key infrastructure as well. You can do this, yeah. I mean, it's the same problem in a different protocol, so to speak. I mean, if first of all, normal DNS is not secure. You agree, right?
Yeah.
DNSSEC, in a way, is secure, but it relies on a public key infrastructure as well, right?
Well, even without DNSSEC, it would. I think it would reduce at least for some kinds of problems, the amount of intrusion possible, like for spamming or...
Well, I mean, yeah, okay.
Using DNS, you'll at least protect against passive attacks. So sure, you're not protected against active attacks, but at least you got all the passive listeners on prevention there. So you can look up a key in DNS and get a secure connection going if you're using IPsec or something else.
Well, I mean, if we had DNSSEC, I agree with you, then we could use this. But otherwise, I mean, we have DNS cache poisoning and all that stuff. I mean, it's just in a different layer. I don't see.
But those are all active attacks. At least you'll prevent all the passive eavesdropping of the person next to you in Starbucks.
Okay. Yeah. Other questions?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
You mentioned back-to-back user agents. What is it, and how would they solve the problem that you said that they would solve?
Yeah, okay. I got over this really quickly. But when you think about anonymity, right? Usually how is anonymity solved? You have something like a mix server that gets lots of messages, exchanges values, and then passes them on, right? And the same you could do with what's called a back-to-back user agent in ZIP, which is basically a server or a proxy that takes headers, replaces the values, and passes it on. Of course, it then stores this connection, how it changed headers in a table, and then if message get back, it can pass these on again. So it's basically, back-to-back user agent is a ZIP term. It stands for a server that reacts as a user agent in both directions. And this is exactly what we need for anonymity or pseudonymity, because then the receiver of the message thinks it's coming from the pseudonymity service. Okay?
I actually just have a small remark. You mentioned some approaches to fight against SPID problems, maybe. And you mentioned the micropayments approach and maybe some computational stuff. I think it's a bit outdated nowadays, since those spam guys already use botnets, and so they could also use the computational power, which is maybe then remotely distributed, or they could use other people's micropayments. So I think this doesn't
right.
help
I mean,
anymore.
the micropayment solution only works. If we had a botnet, or if the spammer has a botnet, then it doesn't work, of course, yeah. That's true. It's just, I mean, all the solutions against SPID I've put up, I probably didn't say this clear. These are all some solutions that work in some scenarios, but there is no general solution for SPID. We probably, and then the prototype I've shown you, again, that will be presented in Hamburg in more detail, is, as far as I know, a mixture of all these approaches. So, there is probably not the approach against SPID, or at least from my point of view, because all of these approaches have some issues.
Another question about SPID approaches. There's a third approach to SPID prevention, which doesn't look at the content at all, but and is only feasible for larger voice providers by looking at call patterns and identifying SPID senders based on their call pattern. You see if there's an automatic dialer in work.
And I assume that most voice over IP providers are starting to look into this. I didn't put this up, but I agree with you, yes. Mm-hmm. And I assume that, like I've said, SPID is a field where there's, I assume, lots of research going on that's non-public, because it eventually also will be, it relates with patents and there's markets and revenue and all that kind of stuff. So I assume that large voice over IP providers look into this and have already some kind of IDS that filters out SPID messages. I know that GSM providers, for example, do this with SMS messages and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. But there's, then there's one problem left. If you do identify a SPID call at the provider, you're not legally allowed to just drop it, which is another area of concern.
Say again, you're not illegally allowed to
Legally,
drop?
you're not allowed to drop it, because that would be suppressing communications. You can't be sure that it's SPID and that the receiver doesn't want it. So this is an area...
Is this true? I mean, as far as I know, providers drop messages if they think it's malicious. They do.
There's common carrier status for telcos that wasn't... Sorry. There's a common carrier status where you're not allowed to do anything with... You should just be guaranteed to deliver the message.
And that comes back to the issue if voice over IP providers are telecommunication providers.
Yes, exactly.
And that's different in every country. I know in the US they are considered if they have more than, I think, 10,000 users. And in Germany they are have considered. So it's also depends on regulation and the country where you're in.
And speaking of regulation, you mentioned the lawful interception. Of course, if you're using SIP, you're using IP network, and for IP networks, there are lawful interception standards already. So, for instance, in Europe, there's the ETSI standard called Transport over Intercepted IP Traffic, which you can find the specification on OpenTap.org. But it's basically, as soon as they know who you are and what IP address you'll be using, what provider you use, they can actually lawfully intercept you at the IP level and take all your traffic.
But what if you change your ISP every time you make a phone call by using an internet cafe and you use a zip provider in some country that is not within legal range of your government?
I'm not doing the government's job. Yes, it's very difficult to get people who are really smart, but
so,
most criminals are not smart.
I mentioned this paper there, and what they write is that basically what it comes down to, if you want a complete lawful interception for voice over IP, you will have complete IP interception. And I don't know if this is where it's getting, but it seems to be that it's getting there. Yeah.
It's already there.
Yeah, but is it deployed?
Yeah. Sorry.
I'm not sure.
Yes, it's mandatory for many ISPs. For instance, I know in Holland it's mandatory that if you don't comply to the TIIT specifications, they can shut you down.
It depends on the country, right? Okay.
But all the ministers of justice have come together half a year ago and they've agreed on a European-wide standard implementation. So this will spread over the entire EU.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So about lawful interception, it was mentioned last year here that at least some European countries want to require from the registration server that he can do lawful interception.
Right, but that only helps if the person you're trying to catch is using a registration server within the legal range of the country. Yeah. And I mean, we're talking the internet, so I mean, if there's it's the same with servers for malware that are located in some other country. You know, it's the same problem.
Any more questions?
Other questions?
Okay. You talked about your testing tool. Mm-hmm. Did you test it against remote SIP proxies? And if yes, how did they react?
Say again, test against what?
Against remote SIP proxies, not local ones.
No, we didn't. I mean, we didn't test it against proxies yet, and also not against remote proxies, because you got to be careful if you send messages that you know are going to cause the proxy to send it to some proxy that's generating revenue for a company, right? So we wouldn't do that. But what you can do is you can find out what implementation. I didn't put this up here, but 2 years ago we had a test of German zip providers where we just looked into the messages, and most zip providers let you know what zip proxy they're using from the. It's within the message. So of course you don't know what configurations they have, but you can, if you find a vulnerability, you probably know that they are susceptible to it. Yeah, but you shouldn't do these. I mean, you shouldn't send malicious messages to a proxy that's in use. Okay, more questions? Yeah, back.
You mentioned this approach with the self-certifying SIP URIs for peer-to-peer SIP networks, but then you also say you need to somehow find out the right URI to your user, because no one wants to have a user ID like 4W3X5031 or something like this. But then if you do this in some external service, then you bind your whole security system. You bind it on some external service. So then you could easily distribute the public keys via your external system.
Very well observed. That's exactly a problem that is not solved with the self-certifying zip URIs. I call this problem bootstrapping authentication, and you've just described it pretty well. I mean, at some point, if you want to communicate with somebody you don't know, you need to look up his and